Hello and welcome back to Echoes of the Night. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're relaxing at home, winding down for the night, or just looking for a story to keep you company, you're in the right place. As always, feel free to let me know where you're listening from in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying the stories. There's more to come. Tonight's story is one that takes you into a world of ordinary moments and strange happenings, where the line between comfort and unease is razor thin. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let's begin. The aroma of melted cheese and garlic butter filled the air as Ethan carefully placed the pizza box on his kitchen counter. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking midnight, a time when the world seemed quieter, almost like it was holding its breath. Ethan had grown fond of these late-night indulgences, a guilty pleasure he justified with his long, exhausting shifts at the diner. His small apartment, nestled on the third floor of an aging building, had its quirks. Creaky floorboards, flickering lights, and a drafty window that refused to close fully. But it was home. Tonight, it was especially inviting, with the soft hum of his space heater providing a comforting backdrop to the chill outside. He opened the pizza box and chuckled. The slices were uneven, as though someone had been in a rush to cut them. "Not exactly gourmet, but it'll do," he muttered to himself, grabbing the largest slice and settling onto his worn-out couch. The glow from the TV bathed the room in pale light as Ethan scrolled through his favorite streaming service. He stopped at a classic horror movie, the genre he enjoyed but rarely found genuinely frightening. Tonight, though, the dim lighting and the solitude made him hesitate for a moment before pressing play. As the movie began, Ethan noticed something odd. The pizza tasted slightly off. Not bad, just different. He inspected the slice, wondering if the toppings had been switched. Maybe they used a new sauce or something, he thought aloud, shrugging it off. The first 20 minutes of the movie passed uneventfully, and Ethan began to relax. He stretched out on the couch, enjoying the warmth of the heater and the soft buzz of his phone vibrating with social media notifications. But then a sound broke the quiet, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Ethan froze, the pizza slice halfway to his mouth. He muted the TV, straining to identify the source. It sounded like it was coming from the window. His apartment was on the third floor, and there was no fire escape outside that window. The thought sent a chill down his spine. "It's probably just the wind," he reassured himself, though his voice wavered slightly. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached the window. The tapping stopped abruptly as he drew closer. He peered outside, his breath fogging up the glass. The street below was deserted, the faint glow of a street lamp illuminating empty sidewalks and parked cars. He stood there for a moment longer, listening. The silence felt heavier now, almost oppressive. Just as he sat down, his phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a notification. It was an incoming call. The screen displayed an unknown number. Ethan frowned, debating whether to answer. Midnight was an odd time for anyone to call. Curiosity got the better of him, and he swiped to accept. "Hello?" There was no response, just a faint crackling sound, like static on an old radio. "Hello? Who is this?" Ethan repeated, his voice firmer now. The static grew louder for a moment, before abruptly cutting off. The call ended, leaving Ethan staring at his phone with a mixture of confusion and unease. Shaking his head, he tried to dismiss it. "Probably just a prank," he muttered, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Ethan returned to his movie, determined to enjoy the rest of his night. But as the minutes ticked by, he found it harder to focus. The tapping sound returned, this time louder and more insistent. His heart raced as he glanced toward the window, the curtain now drawn tightly shut. He considered ignoring it, but his curiosity won again. Slowly, he approached the window, his steps tentative. As he reached for the curtain, the tapping stopped. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the fabric. Then, with a quick motion, he pulled it aside. The street below was still empty, but now faint smudges appeared on the outside of the glass, like fingerprints pressed against the window. I followed. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "How?" he whispered, his mind racing. No one could reach that window without a ladder. Or wings. A sudden, sharp knock on his front door made him jump, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. He spun around, staring at the door, his mind filled with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Ethan stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the door. The sharp knock echoed in his ears, each beat sending a ripple of unease through him. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the impatient thud of a delivery driver. It was deliberate, measured, too calculated for comfort. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to call someone. But who? The police? What would he even say? That someone had knocked on his door? That his window had smudges? It sounded ridiculous, even to him. Another knock, this one louder. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice betraying his nerves. Silence. He waited, straining to hear any movement beyond the door. The hallway outside was usually quiet at this hour, with most of the building's residents either asleep or engrossed in their own lives. But now, the silence felt alive, like it was waiting for him to act. Swallowing hard, Ethan approached the door. He peered through the peephole, expecting to see nothing. Instead, he saw a figure. The distorted view through the fish-eye lens didn't offer much detail, but the figure appeared tall and motionless, shrouded in shadows. They stood just out of the light cast by the hallway bulb, their features obscured. Ethan's breath hitched. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice firmer this time. No response. He stepped back from the door, his mind racing. Should he open it? Ignore it? Call for help? He noticed a table in the center. A sudden thought struck him. What if it was someone in trouble? Someone who needed help but couldn't speak? The idea gnawed at him, conflicting with his growing sense of dread. Summoning his courage, Ethan unlocked the door and opened it a crack, the chain still latched. "Hello?" The hallway was empty. He blinked, his eyes darting left and right. The figure he'd seen was gone. The faint hum of the hallway's fluorescent light was the only sound. Ethan shut the door quickly, bolting it and re-engaging the chain. His pulse raced as he pressed his back against the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Exercise. As he stood there, his phone buzzed again. He nearly dropped it in surprise. The same unknown number was calling. This time hesitation gave way to frustration. He answered the call, his voice sharp. "Who is this? What do you want?" The static returned, louder than before. Beneath it, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper, almost too soft to discern. "What did you say?" Ethan pressed the phone closer to his ear, straining to make out the words. The whisper grew louder, forming words that sent a chill down his spine. "Don't open the door." Ethan's hand trembled as he ended the call, his mind racing. The door. But he already had. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the small candle he'd lit earlier. He spun around, his eyes darting to the window. The curtain flapped gently, though he was certain he'd closed it tightly. Approaching the window cautiously, he saw that it was indeed shut, though the smudges on the glass seemed more pronounced now, like they were pressing inward. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't at the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Ethan froze, his ears straining to pinpoint the source. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen. Grabbing the nearest object, a heavy metal flashlight, he moved toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. The kitchen was dimly lit, the overhead light flickering slightly. The tapping continued, rhythmic and unrelenting, leading him to the pizza box on the counter. He stared at it, confused. The box sat exactly where he'd left it, but the lid was now closed. He was certain he'd left it open after grabbing his first slice. Summoning his courage, Ethan reached out and lifted the lid. The pizza inside was untouched, as though he hadn't taken a slice at all, but something was different. The toppings had shifted, forming what looked like a crude, jagged smile. Ethan recoiled, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The overhead light flickered violently, before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Nevertheless, Bruce and Harold managed to stay. In the pitch-black silence, Ethan's breathing was loud and ragged. He fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers trembling as they searched the floor. When he finally found it and turned it on, the beam illuminated the pizza box. The jagged smile was gone, replaced by a single word, scrawled in a dark, greasy smear across the lid. Gacy Angogarat. Ethan stared at the word scrawled across the pizza box, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam danced across the greasy smear, making the word almost seem alive. Run. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation that didn't involve the unthinkable. A prank, maybe? But how? No one had been in his apartment. At least, no one he'd seen. The oppressive silence pressed against him, making every small noise, a creak, a drip from the faucet, feel deafening. He took a shaky step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But leave for where? The hallway outside felt no safer than the shadows inside. He grabbed his phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. Mia. Pick up, he whispered, the ringing tone seeming to echo endlessly. Finally, she answered. Ethan, what's going on? It's late. She shook her head. Her voice, warm and familiar, was a lifeline. Mia, something weird is happening. I think someone's messing with me. Messing with you? What do you mean? He hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding insane. There's writing on my pizza box and noises. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like someone's here. Mia's tone shifted, concern replacing her initial grogginess. Did you call the police? Tell them what? That my pizza is haunted? His voice cracked, the tension spilling out as nervous laughter. Then this isn't funny. If you're scared, just leave. Come to my place. Her suggestion was tempting, but the idea of stepping into the hallway filled him with dread. I don't think I can. Something's off. Then stay on the phone with me, Mia said firmly. We'll figure this out together. Glenn murmured a silent prayer, but spoke no words. Her steadiness gave him a small measure of comfort. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept the flashlight trained on the box as he backed out of the kitchen. The greasy words seemed to shimmer in the light, taunting him. Hey, he gasped. What's happening now? Mia asked. Nothing, I'm in the living room, A loud thud interrupted him, the sound coming from the bedroom. Ethan's heart stopped. Ethan? Mia's voice was sharp. There's someone in the bedroom, he whispered, his pulse hammering in his ears. Don't go in there, she said quickly. Just get out of the apartment. But his feet were already moving. Drawn by a mix of fear, he tightened his grip on the flashlight, pushing the door open with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar layout of his room. Nothing seemed out of place, until he saw the closet door. It was open just a crack, enough to reveal a sliver of shadow deeper than the surrounding darkness. Ian, there? What's happening? Mia's voice crackled through the phone, but he barely heard her. He approached the closet, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker here, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Reaching out, he grabbed the edge of the closet door and yanked it open. Nothing. The closet was empty, just his clothes and a few scattered boxes. He exhaled shakily, relief washing over him in waves. "I think it's okay," he said into the phone, his voice trembling. But as he turned to leave the room, his flashlight flickered, the beam wavered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. He tried to climb back, and then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and unnaturally still, its face obscured by the darkness. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Mia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's someone here." "Hey, Ethan, get out of there." The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it were waiting for him to act. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan pointed the flashlight directly at it. The beam illuminated nothing. The corner was empty. He blinked, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. Had it been a trick of the light, his imagination? Then he noticed the closet door. It was open again. Ethan staggered backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The closet door was ajar again, though he was certain he'd closed it moments ago. The silence in the room was oppressive, a void that seemed to amplify his shallow, panicked breaths. "Mia," he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible. "I don't think I'm alone." "Even, you need to leave. Don't wait. Just get out of there now." Her voice was urgent, but it felt distant, like a faint echo against the suffocating stillness of the room. His legs refused to move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but fear rooted him in place. He stared at the closet, its dark interior like a gaping maw, daring him to step closer. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the rustling of fabric or the sigh of the wind. But there was no breeze, no movement, just that sound, slipping through the darkness like a sinister melody. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight, its weak beam his only defense. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. No one answered. The whisper stopped. For a moment the silence was complete, stretching taut like a wire about to snap. "Leave now." The words sent a chill down his spine. They were faint, but unmistakable. A voice that seemed to echo not just in the room, but inside his own head. "Ethan, what's happening? Talk to me." Mia's voice pulled him back, grounding him in the moment. "There's someone in the closet," he stammered, his eyes never leaving the shadowy opening. "Don't go near it," she pleaded. "Just get out of the apartment and call the police." Ethan wanted to listen, wanted to turn and run, but his feet moved on their own. He approached the closet, his hand outstretched, as if drawn by an invisible force. The flashlight flickered again, its beam dimming as he reached the threshold. His hand trembled as he pushed the door fully open. The closet was empty. Ethan's breath hitched, relief and confusion warring within him. But as he stepped back, something brushed against his arm, cold and fleeting, like the touch of a ghost. He spun around, the flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. The walls, the floor, the bed. Everything was as it should be. But then he noticed the pizza box. He was no longer in the kitchen. It sat on his bed, the word "run" glaring at him in the flashlight's beam. Ethan's stomach turned. He hadn't touched the box. There was no way it could have moved on its own. He nodded. "Ethan, are you still there? What's going on?" Mia's voice was frantic. "The box," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's on my bed now." "You have to listen to me. Let me explain first." He nodded, though she couldn't see him. She was right. He needed to leave. But as he turned toward the door, the whisper came again, louder this time. The word froze him in place. It was commanding, insistent, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Shuka had looked. The flashlight flickered wildly, plunging the room into brief bursts of darkness. When the light stabilized, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. On the wall above the bed, written in what looked like ash, was a single word: "Welcome." Ethan stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. Mia's voice was faint now, distant and muffled, as if the room itself were swallowing the sound. The whisper came again, almost playful now. "Stay with us." Ethan's vision blurred, his breathing shallow and erratic. He grabbed the doorknob and yanked the door open, his only thought to escape. But as he stepped into the hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks. The hallway was gone. In its place was a void of swirling shadows, an endless expanse of black that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Ethan's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling into the darkness. The last thing he heard before the light went out was the whisper, now a chorus of voices, surrounding him. To stay, forever. Ethan blinked, his breath hitching as the shadows swallowed the hallway. The familiar contours of his apartment door frame had vanished, replaced by an endless blackness that seemed to ripple like the surface of a dark lake. Should he turn back? No, he muttered, scrambling backward. His hand scraped against the cold, unyielding floor, now smooth and featureless. The phone lay just out of reach, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing. Mia's voice was distant, distorted, as though she were speaking through layers of static. "Ethan, answer me." "Are you okay?" He lunged for the phone, clutching it tightly as though it were a lifeline. "Mia," he gasped, his voice trembling. "The hallway. It's gone. There's nothing here. Just darkness." "What do you mean, gone?" "Ethan, you're not making sense." Ended the dream. I'm not. He stopped, his voice catching as the darkness seemed to shift, taking on a strange, undulating motion. It wasn't just a void. It was alive. I'm not the first," he managed to say. A low hum filled the air, a vibration that resonated in his chest and made his teeth ache. It grew louder, morphing into a sound like distant whispers, overlapping and echoing in a language he couldn't understand. Ethan stumbled to his feet, clutching the phone like a talisman. "I need to get out of here," he whispered. He turned back toward his apartment, but the door was no longer there. The room itself had dissolved into the same swirling shadows, leaving him standing in an endless, featureless expanse. "Stay." The whisper was closer now, louder, and it carried an edge of malevolent glee. Ethan spun in place, his eyes darting through the darkness. "Who's there? What do you want?" The response was immediate, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This refuge stay?" she asked. "Stay with us forever." "No," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm not staying here." The darkness responded with movement. Shapes began to emerge, vague and shifting, like figures made of smoke. They drifted closer, their forms flickering in and out of existence, but their presence was undeniable. Ethan backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Mia, I don't know what's happening. I think something's here with me." "Eden, listen to me," Mia said, her voice steady despite the static. "You need to focus. Look for anything, any light, any way out. Don't let the darkness take you." He nodded, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. His eyes scanned the void, searching for any sign of escape. Then he saw it. A faint glimmer in the distance, like the dying ember of a candle. "I can be a better wife," he said. Without thinking, he ran toward it, his footsteps echoing strangely in the emptiness. The light grew brighter as he approached, resolving into a small, flickering flame suspended in the air. Supposedly were his only hope of bringing about peace in the isle. As he reached for it, the whispers surged, louder and more frantic. "Don't touch it," they screamed, their voices filled with rage. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the flame. It pulsed with warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive void around him. "Ethan, what's happening? Talk to me." Mia's voice was faint, almost drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. "I think I've found a way out," he said, his voice shaking. "Then take it. Don't wait. Just go." The figures in the darkness surged forward, their shapes coalescing into something more solid. They reached for him with hands that seemed to dissolve and reform, their touch leaving trails of icy cold in the air. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed the flame, its warmth flooding his senses. For a brief moment, the whispers fell silent, replaced by a blinding light that engulfed him completely. When the light faded, he found himself lying on the floor of his apartment, the familiar surroundings a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just escaped. The pizza box was gone. His phone buzzed in his hand, Mia's voice coming through loud and clear. "Ethan, are you there? What happened?" "I'm back," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how, but I'm back." "Thank God," she said, relief evident in her tone. "Get out of there now. Don't stay another second." Ethan nodded, forcing himself to his feet. But as he moved toward the door, he froze. On the wall above the bed, written in the same ash-like substance as before, was a new message. "You can't leave." Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at the words scrawled across the wall. "You can't leave." The letters seemed to pulse as though alive, each stroke of ash faintly glowing before fading back to black. He stumbled backward, the phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. "Ethan, what's wrong? Ethan!" Mia's voice called out, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. He whipped around, his heart racing. The sound came from the front door. 3 deliberate, heavy knocks that reverberated through the air like a death knell. Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay away. But the oppressive silence that followed the knocks was unbearable. With shaking hands, he crept toward the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. There was nothing there. "Len." The voice came from behind him, low and guttural, sending a jolt of icy fear down his spine. He spun around, his back slamming against the door. The room was empty, but the air felt charged, thick with a presence he couldn't see. "Stay with us," the voice whispered again, closer this time. "No," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm not staying here." The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into a strobe-like chaos. Shadows danced across the walls, their shapes shifting and merging into grotesque forms. "Come, eat the food that our guests leave behind," the high priest said. Ethan grabbed the phone from the floor, gripping it like a lifeline. "Mia, I don't know what to do. It won't let me leave." "Yes, you can," Mia said, her voice urgent. "You have to fight it. Whatever this is, it's feeding on your fear. Don't let it win." Mia nodded. Her words sparked something in him, a flicker of defiance against the overwhelming dread. He forced himself to stand tall, his fists clenched. "You think you can scare me?" he shouted into the darkness. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadows recoiled for a moment, their forms flickering uncertainly. But then the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, a cacophony of rage and desperation. "You belong to us." The air around him grew colder, the temperature plummeting until his breath came out in visible puffs. The shadows surged forward, coalescing into a towering figure with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. Ethan stood his ground, his heart pounding. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I don't belong to you. This is my life, my home, and you have no power here." The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers faltered, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. Ethan seized the moment. He grabbed the nearest object, a small table lamp, and hurled it at the figure. The lamp shattered on impact, and the darkness writhed, its hold on the room weakening. The glowing letters on the wall began to fade, their light dimming with each passing second. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a growing sense of clarity. Ethan moved to the door, his hand hovering over the handle. "Mia," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm getting out of here." "Do it, Ethan, don't look back," Nico said. He took a deep breath and yanked the door open. The hallway stretched before him, its familiar mundane appearance a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just endured. Ethan stepped through, his body trembling with relief, but as he turned to close the door behind him, he froze. The apartment was gone. In its place was an endless void, the same swirling darkness that had tried to consume him. A single whisper drifted through the air, faint and taunting. "We'll be waiting." He slammed the door shut and bolted down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Outside, the cool night air hit his face like a balm, and he collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. His phone buzzed in his hand, Mia's voice breaking through the static. They're all eventually made fit to hold the glue to the bandages, answering questions about the demands for returning to camp. "I'm out," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what that was, but it's over. I'm done." "Good," she said, relief flooding her tone. "Get somewhere safe. We'll figure this out later." Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see him. He stood, his legs unsteady, and began walking toward the street. As he passed a row of parked cars, his reflection caught his eye. For a moment, he thought he saw something behind him, a shadow that didn't belong. But when he turned around, there was nothing there. Shaking his head, he kept walking, the night stretching before him. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, expecting another call from Mia. But it wasn't her. The screen displayed a single message sent from an unknown number. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." Ethan stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. He glanced back at the apartment building one last time, its windows dark and unassuming. Then he turned away and disappeared into the night, leaving the shadows behind. At least for now.